Well, thank you guys for joining. The webinar is now going to begin. It is hosted by Teknion Data Solutions. We are a proud partner of Warescape, which is a data warehousing automation software, Tableau, which we will all know because we're discussing today, Alteryx, which is great for data shaping as well as predictive analytics. I've heard it referred to as the Swiss Army knife of data. Data Robot, which is great for data learning or machine learning, and then also Snowflake, a cloud-based database solution. We are a very proud partner, so if you have needs in any of these areas, we are definitely happy to help you out. I am your host today, Bridget Cogley, and so you can find me at Twitter, Wins Cogley, and then I also blog over at tableaufit.com. Now, Joshua Milligan normally is on these webinars, but he just finished writing his book, and I think he booked it off to the beach. And so warm wishes to him, and also congratulations to him for finishing his brand new iteration of the Learning Tableau 2019 book. It's a great book, highly recommend it. And so lastly, I'm hoping everyone is here for the dashboard design from the mind of a Zen master. And so that comes kind of courtesy of a dashboard we may look at later on as well. And so part of this is using some neuroscience to improve our dashboard design. We won't get too heavy into the neuroscience, but we will kind of apply 4 rules to improve our dashboards. And good news for you, the recording is automated, so the checkbox has been hit. We are recording this webinar, which leads us right to our housekeeping. And so Q&A will be at the end, but feel free to submit your questions. If there's any technical issues, I'd strongly encourage you to reboot the GoToWebinar client. It does seem like maybe 1 to 5% of people will experience some audio issues or things like that, and those are usually cleared by restarting. Also, again, the recording will be available. It will be at teknionusa.com, and we have a /video page with all of our videos. It is a great place to catch these webinars and many, many others. We do these once a month for a number of different tools, so feel free to check that out. And so without any further ado, I'm going to move right into Tableau and start the presentation. And so a part of this comes from my background. So again, Bridget Cogley, I'm a Tableau Zen master, but what's really important here is I'm a former American Sign Language interpreter. And so that's really informed both my career and how I approach data analysis. And so I've started on the business side, moved into analyzing data, and it really informs how I design dashboards. And that's a passion of mine. And so today, my goals are to help you build what I typically call for myself better dashboards. And these are dashboards that require far less explaining. So as you are showing these dashboards to people, you're not having to explain how they work. People are automatically saying, hey, click there or do this or do that. They're also designed to reduce the amount of rework. I know in the past when I've designed dashboards, you would go through these cycles where it was this back and forth. Okay, I've designed this, and this person's saying, can you make this chart this? Can you make this chart this? I don't want to reduce iteration. What I want to do is reduce the rework and reduce the amount of times you have to go back and forth to get a successful product. And lastly, my goal in this is that these dashboards, when they require far less explaining and they don't require as many iterations or passes back and forth, that they ultimately improve adoption throughout the organization, that users want to use these dashboards. And so that, to me, is how I define a better dashboard, and that's why I hope you're here today. And so the 4 big ideas that I'm going to repeat over and over throughout this presentation, and so feel free to grab a screenshot of this. This is already out on the web, but these 4 rules I'm going to hit over and over and over again are things like setting the tone, going from large to small, answering a single question, and moving beyond the chart. The first 3 we may be more familiar with, in particular the idea of a single question. I feel like when you take any type of training or you attend any type of blogs, that would probably be the most common lesson I find. Things like setting the tone, perhaps a little bit more ambiguous, and this idea of large to small. I've got the picture of the golden ratio there. It's a little less literal than that. But then the final piece of this is this idea of moving beyond the chart. And that's an area where, when I talk about this, a lot of people struggle. And so I really hope that by attending this webinar today, it'll make a bit more sense. So without further ado, I kind of want to go through a process that may feel very familiar to all of us. And that's when we do this explanation, this exploration of the data, we kind of make all these different charts. Maybe we format within the chart. We kind of say, hey, I built this map because everyone loves maps. And then we get to the point where we're starting to make a dashboard. And what this process may look like is we may double click and throw things out on the dashboard. We may say, okay, well, that's not where I wanted this piece. These two pieces go together. And I may even manually move parts. And then, okay, I've got this heat map and maybe I'll drag it out here. This looks like a traditional 4-box dashboard that historically, if we've taken any trainings from Tableau, we've been taught to make. We may throw the map out here. We may try to drag things around and resize them. This is a process that's probably fairly familiar to all of us. We may look at this dashboard and realize, okay, well, our executives are going to want a hair more on this dashboard. And so I need to put a KPI somewhere. And so I've got these numbers. And I may, again, sit here and finagle with this a bit and, adjust as needed, move things around. And I can sit here and do further adjustments, which leads us kind of into our presentation. So as we evolve this process, we may start fine-lining how we learn containers and start better using containers to line things up a bit more appropriately. We may spend a little bit more time learning that we can float legends, and so that they don't have to be anchored in one spot, that we can float them and put them in unique spots, and they're a little bit more organized that way. And then we may also go through this focus of, hey, let's make it pretty. And we may pick better colors and choose to make things a little less in your face. I know in particular this red is pretty harsh for me. Not always the case for everybody, but for some people red can be very harsh. We've got a lot of colors going on in this, but we've tried to push it back a smidge just with what we're doing here. It's still a lot of colors. And we get to this point where we've made this dashboard and we're really thinking about how do we communicate, how do we make this better for our end users, and we get to a point of feeling very stuck. And I know because this was my path. I very much started in this fashion of I had some charts, I threw them on the dashboard, I spent oodles of time adjusting things and trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. And I got to this point where, hey, the dashboard's really pretty, the colors are great, but something is missing. And I couldn't put my finger on it. And so that's when I went on this long journey, starting in about 2015, of figuring out how in the world do I make better dashboards. This is a journey that's been very well documented. It's something I discussed at Tableau 2016. But I kind of came up with this theory that dashboards are really communication. We've got this rule around dashboards are a number of things. But ultimately, what I came through with is that a dashboard is documented visual communication. And the academic version of this talk focuses on how there is a language within it, that these symbols that we choose have grammatical meaning. And that is not the talk I'm going to give today. It's a talk that resonates for people very, very deeply involved into data visualization. What I find now is in the business world, it doesn't necessarily resonate. A lot of people go, that's great. How do I make this actually work in the real world? And so today's focus is on how do we use these ideas as proper ideas? How do we apply them directly, easily, without struggling or trying to go to the textbook and go, okay, it needs to be like this. And I am going to warn you, I'm going to drastically shift lanes, and there will be a reason. And so what if you'll entertain this, if you can take a few moments, look at this room and think about how you would describe it to somebody who can't see it. And while you're doing that, I'm going to see if I can set up a poll. Okay, well, I have not figured out how to set up the poll, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. Oh. Okay, good news. We might be able to set up the poll. I'll go ahead and take one moment, see if we can do that. This is always fun to get real data when you can. And so again, this is a really great exercise to think about how you describe this room to other people. And so while we're waiting for the poll, really think about kind of where you started with this. What was one of the first things that you chose to describe? And if I can get my poll up, that's what we'll answer is where did you start? I want to know the first piece of information you put together. Okay, so I was not able to get the poll going. But typically when I do this presentation live, I find about 50% of people hit the table. Some 35% of people focus on the window. They say, hey, the window is really important. 10% focus on these lights. These are really nifty lights, so I can definitely understand that. And then about 5% end up on the painting or somewhere else. That's typically what happens in a live presentation. I have seen it vary between the window and the table. So I have seen sometimes the window overtakes the table. Now, the reason for this, I didn't take you on a diversion for no good reason, is that almost nobody says, hey, it's a conference room. And the reason this is important is going into our 4 rules. And I will say there is a language bias. So Native American Sign Language signers will tell you that it's a conference room first, but that's because of grammar. And so there is a language bias. And so with this exercise, part of what I want to highlight is these big ideas. So when we say that it's a conference room, we're setting the tone. We're telling somebody else who can't see what we see that this is a conference room. And I already have an association with a conference room and somebody else has an association with the conference room. We have a certain expectation. And then we move down into there's a wooden table. There is this beautiful bay window overlooking the city. There are these lights that are glass bubbles. And moving on, you'll also notice that when I did that explanation, I started with the largest key points. I started with that this is a conference room, and then I drilled down into the type of table, because when I deal with a conference room, the table is one of the key binding aspects. The window is interesting. And it's also very large. It too sets the tone of that conference room. And you know what I mean if you've been in the difference of a very dark conference room with no windows versus, hey, I at least have insight into the weather outside. I'm also answering a single question, and that question is, what is this room? And the final part is that idea of going beyond the chart. So going beyond that, hey, this is a room, or this is a collection of artifacts. It's not just the collection of artifacts that make the room, it's that we can look at that room and deduce its purpose. And typically in English, we start at the back. So we've seen this practice with the room. How do we apply it to our dashboards? And so part of this is really thinking about the look, the feel, and the flow of our dashboards to provide and support the idea of context. How do we cue our users to immediately understand what it is we're doing without distracting them? And so without further ado, I'm going to start again on that same analysis I did earlier, except for this time, 2 things will be different. First off, I'm going to remove my reminder. I'm going to come down here over to the Objects pane and hit the floating button. And to me, this makes a big difference. The other thing I'm going to do, you'll notice I'm going to scroll down my pre-staged dishes here, my charts. I'm going to start dragging things out. Now, this is something I've done multiple times, so there's a little bit of predestination with this. But I'm going to spend a bit of time pulling things out, putting them where they belong, and looking at how I want this thing to be. Again, I've got this header here. I'm putting the KPIs right in the header, in part because I know I want to do this, but in part, it's a great capture area. It's a nice area to put things that are important, but not necessarily entirely related to the rest of the visualization. And these sort of operate a little independently of the rest of the viz. So I'll move these guys over. I'll adjust them a little bit. I'm not going to spend too much time cleaning up because just like Julia Child, I do have a prepared meal on the other side of this. And so other parts of this I'll drag out. I'm going to take that same metric of sales out. We've seen this before. Going to get rid of the legends for now, just to avoid distraction in this process. Again, pulling things out, thinking about what goes with what. So you automatically see my building style is a bit different. I'm moving things in spots. I'm not necessarily going to put them in these spots, but I'm putting like things with like things. So I've got this map. Maps are pretty interesting. They do require a lot of space. They generate a lot of attention. So I find that they're very handy to use in part when they're very, very large. And so I will make them sometimes as large as possible. One of the other things I'm just going to kind of pull out here is the sales trend. Again, as I'm floating, one thing I'm going to do is making sure that things fit to their proper containers. So in particular, this sales trend works very, very well when it's small and skinny. You'll notice a few other things here, and you can kind of see it now that I've laid these items out. I've got sales and profit, and sales is in a particular shade of blue, and profit is in this unusual kind of teal color, so it's a little bit more in the green family. And you'll notice that with this sales by category, I've taken that same kind of attitude and said, okay, this will be more green than blue. And I'm just kind of laying these pieces out for me to think about what goes together, what makes a compelling story. And what I may say is, okay, I'm overtaking the message here a little bit, so I'll shrink down my map just a tiny bit. And then I'm going to pull this sales trend down here. I'm also going to think about how do things line up a bit. And so I'll move items around, stretch this out a bit. And you'll see part of what I'm starting to do is, again, setting the tone. I have really focused on making the colors as quiet as possible. I'm thinking about relationships now. And because Tableau isn't in a tiled fashion, I don't have things bouncing around. So personally, for me, I'm getting less distracted. I'm having less movement in my visual flow. And so when I start placing things, I can think more about what relates to what rather than fighting where the form is falling. So you can see I've made this relationship now between sales and profit by placing these items here. We'll go ahead and move on to the finished version of this dashboard, which is here. And so you'll notice that in lieu of a legend, I added an additional bar chart just to provide additional information and to also provide a hover point. I find this line chart in particular is a bit noisy. And so anything I can do to help manage the noise of this particular chart, it's important. It gives me a trend, but it is very noisy. And so I want to mitigate that as much as possible by providing opportunities to highlight what's important. You'll notice I added some ink. I intentionally put in some ink to reinforce the idea of a brand and also to pull these numbers together and place them accordingly. I've got my legend for this map. I went ahead and put in a text title so I could get things to align nicely. One of the other things I did, you'll notice there are almost no drop-down filters on this particular dashboard, which usually a lot of people say, well, that's great, but I need to select a date range. With the advent of set actions, what I can do is I can drag and drop. So this is a little bit more of a D3 kind of intuitive experience that I've taken from data journalism and applied it to my dashboard right here. I'm also providing queuing. I've got this icon right here. This is actually a dashboard button. This is not simply an image, but I'm providing some additional support to end users, just telling them if they're not familiar with this icon, go ahead, lasso, filters to select dates. You'll notice the rest of the dashboard changes in accordance, and I can very easily reset this by reselecting everything. You'll notice all the bars go back to fat. So there are just many different ways of queuing people through icons. You'll notice I've got a click icon here, so that if I click on the state, things filter down to that particular state. I'm doing everything possible to avoid putting any more text on this dashboard than I absolutely have to. So I'm setting the tone again by using pushback colors so that people can see the shape of the dashboard first. They can come in and understand this KPI bank goes with this whole thing. It's an overview, and then flow into the most important pieces. So that's kind of how I set the tone. From there, one of the other big design elements I think about is this idea of large to small. And anybody from an English class will tell you you've got main ideas, support, and then you get into details. Another term I use for this is faceting. And so what I'm doing is I'm looking at this from a few different angles, but I'm picking a primary angle and moving downwards. So that's part of why I selected this graphic. And again, when we do our analysis, we're often looking at this through the lens of how are we trying to understand the data? We are analysts. We specialize in this. We speak the language of data. And so we may make a chart like this, which is sometimes very useful to us, but not very useful to anybody outside of us. For the most part, people look at this and say, that's great. You made a bunch of squiggles and a bunch of squares. That's not very useful to me. And so when I look at this, what I'm trying to do is just understand the patterns of the data. And as an analyst, this is a journey I very typically take. I may also put in filters, and I may try to understand the data through various facets and lenses that way. And this may be very helpful to me. It's not helpful to an end user who wants to know or think about where to work in a given day. And so this is real data. This is data from my household. And so when I think about where do I want to work in a given day, I prefer warmer places. And so my Texas audience hopefully will agree. But I'm thinking about where is the warmest place and the most comfortable place I can work. And at a glance, I can see from a high level, my master bedroom typically falls in a temperature I like. The place where I'm supposed to work, and if I ask my boss where I should work, they would typically say you should probably work in your office, which is a very cool 65.8 degrees, not very warm. What this also allows me to do is click and drill down so I can see that I'm progressively getting colder as time goes on. Not a good thing. I can also look at my master bedroom and see that the temperature is pretty stable there, even though I've got a lot of divergence in my readings. So I can look at that and begin to understand what's going on. And the secret of what's going on is I had a humidifier running all night. You can see that the evening gets cooler, the night gets warmer, and that holds pretty well into the day. And we can explore that through this chart. But what this allows us to do is it starts with the most important question: where should I work? And I can see that within my master bedroom. I can get a feel for what's going on day by day. I can also chunk this out into times of day and then drill down into the hour and the individual readings, which are done, I believe, at a millisecond level. So this is an idea of starting from that really high level and going down deeper. The third part of this is the idea of using a single question, and I will even be as literal as to write the question in the title. I will put it in the middle of the dashboard, but this is where I can start with a short answer. So what's the thing I absolutely need to know? I'll start expanding on that answer, but then I'll also tee it up for what's next. And my goal in this is really getting the clarity. I want to help my end user get somewhere and truly understand what it is we're trying to get to. And so this is an extraordinarily simplified analysis of shipments. And so when I'm dealing with shipments, I kind of want to understand what's shipping, so how many items are moving, what does that represent from a product level, so how many different products. I'm considering product diversity. I'm also considering how long did it take things to move from my warehouse to homes. And then did I have to discount? Because discounting may or may not necessarily make me happy. And so you'll see a few things. I've started this in gray. So again, adhering to setting the tone, I've really kept this very simplified because you'll notice that when I'm doing shipment, I may want this to go out to mobile. And so I've designed this very intentionally to work with one of the latest features from Tableau, which is the automatic device designer. So there was a little bit of a deliberate exercise designing towards the algorithm. And so I wanted to answer some very quick, simple questions, such as what are transit times? And then again, because I knew I was looking at deploying this to mobile, I kept it very simple. I knew my interaction point would be these items, and I'll click on this in a moment. And then finally, I wanted to get down to more of those individual readings by product, just to understand, okay, are there certain products moving better than others? Now, again, because I knew this was going on mobile, I wanted to keep it simple. I also wanted to provide more of a comparative analysis rather than a filtering analysis. So I can actually compare different classes to the overall aggregate. And that's what this is designed to do. And this uses another new feature, which is set actions. I'm a big fan. There's a few different posts out there on set actions I strongly recommend. Um, but what I really like about this is that it works well on phone. And so when I think about setting the tone, I know I'm putting this on phone. I've done very intentional design to soften it because particularly the iPhone is a very, very bright device. And so I want to soften that light to make it easier if somebody is in a darkened warehouse to see this. I've chosen yellow because it's fairly colorblind friendly and it stands out just enough. And so I've answered a single question, which is how are things shipping? And I've made it very easy to get to the answer of how are we doing? What's the diversity of shipping? And do I have to be concerned? The final piece of this, and this is where I'm going to spend a little bit more time, is this idea of moving beyond the chart. And some of this is about exploring, building, and then refining, and really think about how do we integrate everything to be a whole piece. Because typically when we're taught to do this work, we're taught to think of charts as these very separate pieces. And so when I look at this final question that I have, and so you see that I've said, okay, I have a single question, and my question is, should every state have access to the same products? And unfortunately, I'm going to answer this question. I live in Ohio, and this is going to make me very, very sad. This is an analysis that, as an Ohioan, this supports a trend I'm seeing happening for real in my state, which is a number of stores are pulling out. So again, I hate when I actually support certain things. But you'll see that I'm pulling these items out. I'm, for now, just thinking about different types of things and what goes together. The crux of my analysis is getting down to these products, so this may go over here. Again, I'm currently moving things around. Certainly, certain types of legends will go away. And what I'm trying to do is really understand how I'm doing on shipping. So you'll notice I kind of pull things out, I'll move things around. I went ahead and captured this up here just because it provides me kind of this high level overview. It doesn't necessarily answer the question because my question really is starting at the state level. And so I've got my state, I've got maybe some comparative categories. And so what I'm trying to do is look at these pieces. And because I have these pieces, what I may realize is that they work well together. And so I may go ahead and blur the lines a bit in my build to integrate, to get people to not just think about this as one piece or the other piece, but to see it as a whole. And so you'll notice I'm actually putting these bars right into the axis. I'm blurring the lines as much as possible. And I'm just working to line these up so that they line up nicely and that I'm cueing on the color. I'm providing extra support without being as explicit as I've historically been when these are treated as separate charts. And again, I've got these labels. I'm going to just tuck those in here and get rid of the title. And again, since I've got transparent sheets now, this is probably my secret favorite feature. I can just push this to the back and I can start making a comprehensive whole. I can look at this map. I may, again, shrink this, get rid of the titles. I like my maps to be as large as possible. It allows people to select them a bit easier. It allows people to see them a bit easier. And I'll fight with things and move things around and kind of think about the messaging I'm giving. And since I have these labeled, I don't necessarily need those categories there. And I can start kind of playing with this and seeing what will work and what won't. And so I may even come over here temporarily, click this filter button, just to see how this works from a user design perspective. And so moving on to the Julia Child version of this dashboard, you can see that when this is integrated, you're getting a part-to-whole comparison, you're getting a legend, and you're getting over time. So this is part of what I mean by moving beyond the chart. A couple more examples of that moving beyond the chart. I've got that same dashboard that I showed earlier, the shipment analysis. But what I've done is I've captured the KPI again in the header. I've put them at the top. I've added some data art just to provide interest and to support the theme I've got going on of dots. You can see I've got these extra little kind of firefly parts that allow me when I'm on a phone to click on these pieces. And that makes it a bit easier if I want to hover over things and I can see the line a bit better to understand what exists. So the final piece is looking at, again, I've got these charts and I've made this experience. I've followed the textbook order of, here's the KPI. And some people may say, well, the KPI actually needs to go higher. And so I may drag that up so that it takes this space. You'll notice that that does very bad things for my map. So then I may spend time adjusting for that as well to really make sure that my map is accessible and prominent. This is missing something for me, though. This is missing guidance for my end user. I don't necessarily have a clear path of how I should use this dashboard. And so instead of doing what a lot of the textbooks tell me, I am going to clutter this up. I'm going to add things, extra ink, to make this more legible and to perhaps blur the line on the charts. And so what I've done here, this header is simply created in PowerPoint. There's lots of tutorials online about how to edit shapes and make shapes curvy, but this is a great way if you've got a marketing department to team up with them. The website is a great source of inspiration for these little design bits. And then I made kind of a little UI console. And I've got the state, and what I did is I highlighted that this teal goes to California. I didn't need a legend for this. I made a legend a part of the design bit. The other thing is I added icons so that faster is this rabbit, slower is this turtle. I went ahead and made them face the point that they're going towards. I've added this gray box just to capture everything to force you to read downward. And instead of trying to figure out where do I read, that was one of my biggest problems with this one is I didn't even know where to start. So when I look at this other one, I know exactly where I should start. It's very prominently featured with the shape. It's called out to a point where I can't ignore it. And then I've got it nicely separated and delineated. I've got California selected. I can select a number of states and this will update. And you'll notice, again, this is another area where I'm using set actions to highlight and make comparisons. And then I've got orders and things like that, so that as I fully select the state and hold it, it does filter. And so that's kind of where this design comes into play. And that's a big part of where, again, thinking beyond the chart, where we can lay these charts out, but sometimes we need more around them to support the messaging that they have. And so these are these big ideas. And again, when we think about setting the tone, some of this is incorporating your company brand. It's not a literal, this color goes to this product, but it's a, what am I trying to highlight? What am I trying to showcase for people? And how do I cue people that these things relate? Some of this is also thinking about when I answer this question, going from the key point, the main idea, and then parsing out to something more detailed and smaller. The single question, this is probably the best covered in other areas where, again, I'm trying to answer a single question. So how do I answer that question? So the question, I know Andy Cotgreave speaks about the 5 whys. And so just getting down to, okay, I've got this idea. And the first answer is a very quick yes, no, good, bad. And then distilling that answer and refining it more and more. But that last piece that I'm going to, if you take nothing else from this, I would love for you to think beyond the chart. It's more than just charts on a page, but thinking about how do I integrate these? How do I provide guidance to the end users so that they can use this when I'm not there? The final deliberate practice that I did around this is I did this future concept. I wanted to answer for myself the idea of a futuristic dashboard and what could that look like. If you watch a lot of sci-fi, they have these on glass. I just think they're so nifty. And so what I wanted to do was play with that idea. And to me, they always have these circles in the middle. They always have these very abstract charts. And I wanted to bring that into my design. And I wanted to answer for myself, what could a dashboard of the future look like? But yet you'll notice that this conforms to the four rules. I'm still answering the big question. I'm still answering this is HR data, and I'm still getting to the point of, okay, there's 16% turnover, and where is it happening? And what's the feedback? And should I be concerned? And what are people telling me? And what I'm getting is that people don't necessarily like to not travel at all, but they don't want to travel constantly. And so that's a part of this. And I've treated this a bit like survey data. So I can kind of see the two groups, the turnover group, which follows the norm of this color, and the non-turnover group, which follows the norm of this color. And so I'm cueing very, very subtly what goes together. I've created lines in random spots, but they're not random. They're highlighting different ideas of feedback. And so I've treated that like a survey. I've also found education in that data. And so I said, okay, well, of the people with the major, what do they comprise of my work population? How many of them turn over? And if I start comparing that and looking at that, again, this is a dashboard of the future, so it's highly abstract. And then lastly, a population pyramid. So I can just understand what does the shape of my personnel look like. Again, because Tableau gave me transparent sheets, I'm able to tuck this bar chart to give me a high level and then a detailed level. The shape works out. I've completely blurred the lines. So I've got this chart flowing into that chart. I've got this major donut that would be a donut that's not really a donut behind this other donut. So everything is contiguous and touching. This would never fly in any of my customers, and I know that. So what I've done is I've also created the quasi-normal version of this. So that way, I've got the extreme play version, but then I've got again, following those same principles, the idea of, okay, I need to know my attrition. I need to understand the feedback from surveys. I need to understand what the population itself looks like. You'll notice that my design changed. I've got less blurring of the lines between the chart, but there's still a lot of blurry lines in this. This is still probably too extreme for what I could get away with a client. But this is something from a deliberate practice exercise that I've used to help people think a little differently about their data, to think a little bit differently about their design. It also answered to me what really makes a futuristic dashboard. One of the other little samples I did with this was I was like, okay, well, this is too extreme for a client, and I know this. But what would it look like if I did kind of a corporate redact, if I made this more corporate adhering and try to highlight the differences? One of the things you'll notice that just by switching it white, it feels less futuristic. The cutting edge of it, the abstractness of it stands out differently to me. And you also notice that instead of the red, I couldn't leave it red. I had to push it to orange because the red was too strong. And then I intentionally left the yellow. The yellow is not a pretty color at all. And a lot of times people cite my work for its color and that they think it's a very beautiful color. Um, I believe the proper name of this color is somewhere around baby poo yellow. It's not a pretty color. It's a deep mustard. It's something that we typically wouldn't cite or use, but I wanted to highlight the differences of what happens when we're perceiving a color against a dark background versus a light background. You'll also notice I could not leave the color in this population pyramid. It had to go. There was too much color going on white, whereas on black, it's fine. It's not nearly as distracting. And so this deliberate practice exercise was really informative to me. It really helped me see how very simple things can set the tone, that even just one color choice can really change the difference of how we perceive things. So the shape of this is the same, but the color difference really makes this feel far less futuristic. It's still very abstract, but it doesn't feel as futuristic. So going back to those rules, I hope that these are helpful. And so kind of in close, again, Bridget Cogley with Teknion Data Solutions. With Tableau Fit, all of these items are out on my blog. They're also available out on my public site, so you can access these. You can download almost this entire presentation right from my Tableau public site. And without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start answering questions. And I do see that there's a lot of questions, so I'll try to work through as many of these as possible, keeping in mind that I may have to follow up with some of these later via email or some other format. And so first question is, there's a big push in my organization, a public university, towards accessibility guidelines, such as WCAG 2.0. This, of course, makes for a more restrictive canvas on which to work. How do you design towards accessibility? First off, thank you, Robert, for posing this question. This is something, when we talk about accessibility, I do feel there's a number of different ways to approach accessibility. The most common accessibility consideration when we're designing dashboards, we think about either limited vision or even screen readers. And so in my experience, the Tableau itself is fairly limited when working with screen readers. When you're dealing with limited vision, higher contrast is helpful. And so one thing to do in that mode is to almost set a button, especially now that we have transparent sheets, to toggle here's a high contrast version versus a traditional contrast version. That's one way to make dashboards a bit more accessible, is by using the transparent backgrounds. And the other part is Device Designer also does allow that. So if you make a tablet view, you can set your sheets transparent. And you can actually change the background based on tablet view versus non-tablet view. So that's another item to consider. One of the other things that we don't necessarily talk about, though, when we're dealing with accessibility is that you've got limited vision, but you also have neurological disorders, so migraines, epilepsy, and so forth, that can be triggered by bad visualization practices. So having grid lines that are potentially too dark. A lot of people sometimes will favor very dark grid lines. Those can cause migraines and even potentially seizures. So think about that as well. The final piece is, again, dealing with different disorders and different ways that brains approach life, is just understanding that sometimes too much contrast can also be overwhelming. So it's good to know that who you have, and especially thinking about when you're dealing with limited screen size, starting small and then moving large. So one of the parts with this stripped down mobile, you'll notice I started entirely in gray. And that's another good design practice, is if you know you're dealing with limited vision, restrict your colors. Make it so that color isn't as important. And a good way to do that is just by designing entirely in either black and white or gray and white. So that's another item to consider for accessibility. I do know, particularly when you're dealing with specific laws or specific design considerations, Tableau, there is a talk through the Tableau conference, I believe it was TC 17 or TC 18, where there was an entire presentation on designing for accessibility. So Juan asks about, I see you use floating instead of tiled. Any feedback why? I'm trying to understand the pros and cons of floating versus tiled. And so for me, I would say the biggest difference in the floating versus tiled debate is simply the analysis you can do. It makes it a little bit more freeing. And you'll see kind of in some of these sample dashboards when I was starting to build that, for me, when I'm moving these things around and trying to analyze data, when I'm trying to think, okay, does this go with this? It's very hard for me to make that connection. I spend a lot of time doing these movements and thinking about, okay, where should this go? And then trying to get it to move. And then we get into container theory, and at this point, I do consider it a theory almost, where you're fighting with containers and you're almost putting these containers out first. It's a pre-scripted analysis, and for me, it's very difficult. So I find that by floating, I'm able to do a little bit more. I'm able to think about, where do these pieces and parts go? I'm also able to, as I throw these things out, because I don't often know what relates with what, okay, this guy relates, and I can kind of move these together and think about it and kind of play around, and I feel it's a little bit more flexible. for the analysis itself and thinking about how do I compose these pieces to tell that story. And I know some organizations are like, it must be tiled. And so I have, for the most part, managed to work almost entirely in floating. And then when I absolutely have to work in tiled, and I honestly can't say that I have in the last 3 years, I may start out floating and then do a second pass tiled just so that way I know here's how I want the analysis to be. So if you're on the fence, I would say go ahead and try it. And then I've got another question. What would be your suggestion for convincing users when they are asked for aesthetics that add no practical value to the dashboard and even make it difficult to pull out in Tableau? So some of it is this eye test that I'll do with users. And I find that this works out best is the fine, I'll do what you tell me, but then I'm going to do a second pass that's for me. So here's what you told me to make, and maybe you told me to put all this extra arty stuff, or you wanted me to make a Sankey chart, even though a Sankey chart doesn't work. I'll do this for you, but then I'm going to do the version that feels correct for me. And I'm going to let you look at both of them and think about it. The nice part about Tableau is it's not expensive to iterate. It's very easy to duplicate, especially if I'm not making a ton of different charts, to where I duplicate pieces and I say, okay, I'll go ahead and delete this, or I'll add this other piece. Maybe I'll delete this, or I'll change and iterate through here. Maybe instead of deleting that, I will, maybe that's too much ink for me and I want to minimize it. And so what's really nice is I can make these changes without affecting that other view. So changes that are extra. Maybe it's this chart and I just want to duplicate this and then do something different with this chart and throw it back on there. So I do find that with Tableau, it's fairly inexpensive to iterate and play around with different iterations and views. So I'd strongly encourage you to not feel like, okay, I can only make one dashboard, but to instead make iterations and do the eye test. And sometimes people need to use it. I do find there's also, you get two different feedback loops when people look at it and say, yeah, that's exactly what I want, versus when people use it. So another trick I do, when particularly with clients, is I'll send them a link and say, use this, and show me how you use this. I don't ask them for feedback. I say, show me how to use this. How would you use this? And that helps the end user look at the design not from an evaluation standpoint of I like this, I don't like this, but from a, oh, this actually works better for the purposes and the questions I'm answering. And then let's see, a couple more questions. I've got among whom would you count your favorite visualization researcher? Who inspires you? Few, Cairo, Tuft. The person that probably inspires me most is actually none of the above. And so there is this awesome blog out there, and anybody who's hung out with me or spent any amount of time with me knows that this is the blog I will recommend you to read, front, back, and center, Viz Candy. And so brilliant lady, she talks about where does inspiration come from. She does very much the same thing, where she'll look at a number of different things and make her own and really come to it. And there's a practical side, there's a real sensitivity around design, and there's a lot of practical examples. So if I had to say one person who inspired me, it's definitely Kelly Martin. The other part, when I start looking at visualization research, I'm getting a lot into neuroscience. So there is Mark Changizi, writes a lot about how does the brain detect patterns and how do we see. So he's got a whole book on just how we see things. And so I do a lot of reading there. So I'm actually probably more heavily in the neuroscience piece than I am pure visualization. I definitely look at the discussions happening in the data viz space, but for the most part, I'm looking at other disciplines and other areas. I'm also bringing in a lot of neurolinguistics. Again, that's a little bit of my background. And so I'm using things like how do we communicate using space? And I'm pulling that in. I'm delving into some UI research. And so I follow a lot of researchers on Twitter, both in neuroscience from a UI standpoint. really kind of getting outside of the very literal field and taking a more interdisciplinary approach. And then, hi Bridget, great presentation. Curious about the nomenclature. Um, I think this is my bonus question. Um, so one of the things that gets called out sometimes is how I name sheets. And so some of this is demo naming. So I know that all of these pieces need to be used for a live build. So some of this is purely because when I'm working and I'm working very quickly, I want these pieces to go on the dashboard. I want these pieces to go on the dashboard, and I want these pieces to go on the dashboard. That said, there is client naming. There is a thought and logic to the naming schema. So when you download a number of my workbooks, you'll notice they have these 1.1, or it'll even be, pardon me, if I have multiples, I'll have kind of an abbreviation, then a 1, then a name. And so part of this follows what I intend the reading flow to be. What do I think the reading flow is? And that helps both me as well as anybody who picks this up after me to follow the logic and know where things live. So it's a great handoff tool, and it's something I use so that way people can find things and understand the clusters I've made. So great question, thank you. And then another question is, how do you choose a color scheme for a dashboard? So it really depends. So sometimes I work with a client, and when I work with a client, I will go off and do my own little research. So some of it is I'll look at, their website. I'll go and examine. So for example, I've got a Jenny's dashboard, and Jenny's is using orange. I did an Ohio State dashboard. So this is my Jenny's dashboard. But oftentimes, if I'm free to pick my own scheme, I've certainly got colors I favor. But it's less about the actual colors and more about the thought process of how those colors are used. And I've done my own kind of informal test on this just with playing with colors. So I've got this workbook out here where to me it's less about the colors themselves and more about how the colors are used. So again, brown, not very pretty, but because it's put together in a sensible fashion, you're cued. You understand what this is attempting to tell you. That so some of it is playing. There are tools out there like coolers. So I believe it's there's a number of tools out there. So coolers is a great way to pick out colors fast. I do try to keep it limited to only so many colors. And one of the other things I'll use is this Peloton. And what Peloton does is it helps you mathematically calculate where colors are in the relationship. And unfortunately, there is So this is another tool that I'll use to sometimes pick certain colors. What I like to do is pick colors with some level of a mathematical relationship so that when they're falling together, we know they're going to work together. So that's probably the big thing. I am also an artist, so there is a level of intuition almost with it, but some of it's also color practice. So I've got, thank you. Going back to the tiled question, do you have any recommendations for how to use floating sheets but have the dashboard have a responsive size? Unfortunately, that to me is probably one area that floating does not work well in. Typically what I do is I start with the smallest size and then let it go larger. But for the most part, I do all of my dashboards as a fixed size. So for example, this dashboard isn't going to flex out to a bigger size. If I find that's needed, again, that's an area where floating may help. To me, again, that's where I'll start with the design as floating, and then if I need to shift to tiled, then I will. But for the most part, what I try to do is I vet an organization, understand what screens they have, and if I know that, okay, this dashboard is going to be on this big screen, plus people are going to be using it, I may even make multiple iterations of it just to get it sized appropriately. And then I love the use of avoiding filters. This is the greatest battle I face with users. They feel like they need to have filters on a dashboard and can't use objects to filter. How do you sell the use of graphs to filter rather than filters? Practice. Really, it's the more you build these, sometimes people realize and they don't want to mess it up. Sometimes it's also working with people. A lot of times these filters are because of fear. There is this idea of you can't have the data and I don't trust you with the data. And so working with people, and sometimes it's finding one person to be your champion and letting them fight that battle for you. So you work with them, you collaborate with them, you build a dashboard that works with them, and you have them help spread that message. So when I find people clinging to, I must have 900 filters, sometimes what I'll do is I'll sit with them and watch how do they use the dashboard? How do they, if I can, I'll take a whole day and just see how they use that dashboard. What are you doing? And how can I build it better? And sometimes at the end of the day, it's you build these and you build the monster pivot table ultimately, because sometimes it really is the hunt for the number. And then can we download the workbook for this presentation afterward? Absolutely. It is all out on the Tableau public site. And so all of these are out there. You'll see the download for the most part is open. So that is all out there. And then, I mean, those are free for learning. So thank you guys for attending this webinar. I know we ran a smidge long. This will be recorded and this will be posted. So thank you guys very much.